Hi and welcome to Swedish Plantguys. Today we will give you all you need to know about the Thuja occidentalis, also known as the American Arborvitae, also known as the northern white cedar. Now there are a couple of varieties of this plant as well. Here in Sweden the most common ones are called Brabant or emerald green or smaragd. No matter which variety you have at home or you buy, the information in this video will help you take care of that plant. Now the Thuja is a conifer, which means that it's a cone-bearing seed plant with vascular tissue. And it is evergreen, which means that it does not lose the leaves in wintertime or the needles that we usually say when it's a conifer. It will have the needles on the plant all year round. Now the plant has a fan-shaped branch with scale-like needles or leaves on them, and it can get really old, over 800 years old. And the name actually comes from that. The Thuja or Arborvitae actually means tree of life. Now you can use this in your garden as a solitary plant, but usually you use it as a hedge plant, and that is what this video will be focusing on. But if you have it as a standalone plant, it can become quite big. Now I'm 6'4", look at this. Now as usual we will divide this up into 4 parts. You have the purchase, the planting, the placement and the care of the plant. And we'll put timestamps in the description below so you can skip forward if you want to. But as always we recommend you to watch the entire video to get all the information. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do, and hit that bell as well so you get a notification every time we put up something new. And also if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. It's always appreciated, and please share with your friends. Starting off with the purchase. Now when you go out and buy a Thuja, it's usually because you want to have a hedge, a nice full hedge. Now there are 3 different ways you can buy your Thuja plants, and I'll explain them all to you. First off, you can buy a Thuja that is pot planted, which means that it has basically grown from a small seedling to a larger plant in a pot. Now this usually means that the plant will be a little bit smaller, a little bit more narrow, but it will have a full massive root system, and none of the roots will be damaged or hurt when transported to you. Now the second way is that you can buy a plant that has been field grown. Now if it's field grown you will usually have a little bit bigger, little bit fuller plant. However, when it's time for them to dig that up and transport it to you, they can't get the entire root ball because that takes too much space and it weighs too much. So what they usually do is that they have to cut a bit of the root system off to be able to transport them as a root ball. Now the third way is also a field grown plant, but when they dig it up they actually take away all of the soil around the roots. They bare root the plant. This means that it's very easy to transport the plants to you because they can just load them up in a container and pack them close together. This means that it will be cheaper for you to get the transport. However, always keep in mind that when you bare root a plant, as soon as you do that, the roots start to decompose. They start to get worse. So if you buy a bare rooted plant, you need to make sure that you get them into your own soil at home as soon as possible. And if it takes a little while, you have to make sure that the roots are always moist. They must never dry up. The Thuja plant is fairly cheap, no matter which one of these 3 different type of plant you buy. If it is the pot planted, the root ball or the bare rooted one, it's quite cheap. But if you are out in the garden center so that you can choose your plants, what you need to be looking for are that the plant doesn't have any yellow leaves, or if they have leaves with burnt edges on them or brown edges. because that usually means that those plants have been deprived of water. And it also means that when you buy that plant, you will start with a disadvantage. So make sure that they are fully green. However, they can have new, if it's started to grow, they can have small new leaves on them, and it's perfectly normal that those leaves are a little bit brighter in color, a little bit lighter green in color. That's fully normal. And also, if you buy them yourself at the garden center and you are going to transport them to your home, make sure to put something over them when you put them on the truck or in the car or wherever you're trying to transport them, because if they are standing and getting a lot of wind on them, what actually happens is that a lot of the water in the foliage is going to start to evaporate. And that means that when you get it home, you also have a disadvantage because a lot of the water inside of the plant has started to disappear. So try and cover them when you transport them to your home. Now moving on to the planting. Now when you get your plants home, if you are going to create a hedge, you need to start digging a trench. And that trench needs to be about 15 to 20 centimeters wider than the root ball or the pot that you've bought, and also 15 to 20 centimeters deeper than the root ball. Now, if you are planting a solitary Thuja, the same thing applies. Now, the hole that you're digging out should be in the same way, 15 to 20 centimeters wider and 15 to 20 centimeters deeper than the root ball. Now, that soil that you have there, you're actually going to use that, so don't throw that away. Just keep it next to the trench or the hole that you have dug. And then you need to mix that soil, your own soil, up with some new soil. Now it's really, really important that that new soil has a lot of compost or a lot of humus in it, because you need to have a soil that can retain a lot of water, but it doesn't want to be too moist. It needs to have good drainage. So basically, if you have a soil that has a lot of clay, if you know that it's really, really hard and can retain a lot of water, you need to dig out a big trench and you need to mix that up with some new soil to get it to be more, to get it to have more drainage. Now on the other side of that, if you have a sandy soil, you also need that new soil to make it hold more water, because the sand in that soil will have too much drainage in it. Now the most important thing here is that your Thuja never wants to be standing in water. That is why you're digging a bigger trench than the root ball you have, so that all of that water that you're going to be giving it is going through that root ball, and then it doesn't stay in the bottom of the hole so that the root ball will get trenched, but you have a drainage so that the water continues to go down. That is the most important thing of all. Now you mix that up with your soil, and then you plant your Thuja. Now we recommend you to be planting your Thujas in early spring or in autumn. The reason for that is that if you try and plant this in the middle of summer, when it's really, really hot, you won't be able to give it enough water, because you want that soil and that root ball to be evenly moist all the time. And if it dries out too quickly, you can actually hurt the roots. So if you plant it in early spring or in autumn, you will have the best possible chance of making it. In some parts of the world, you can plant this all year round. But even if you can do that, we recommend you to do it in spring or in autumn to get the best results. Now the last thing about the planting your Thuja is that you need to be aware of all the weeds that can appear, because you have dug up quite a lot and it's quite easily for weeds to get in there and start to grow. But if you don't pick that out all the time, what will happen is that that weed is actually going to compete with the nutrients in that soil. And all of that nutrients that are in that new soil that you have added needs to be for the Thuja. So make sure that you pick that weed as soon as it comes out. Moving on to the placement. Now, where should you place your Thuja? Well, usually that is depending on where in your garden you want to have this hedge. Now, you can place it almost anywhere, but be aware that if you have a placement where it's quite dark, or if it's shady all the time, your Thuja will not be as dense and it will not grow as fast as in a placement where you get a lot of sun. And also, when you place your hedge, usually you will have one side that will get more sun than the other side. Now, the side that is towards the sun will grow faster, will be denser, and the other side will be a little bit more thin. Now, you can't do anything about this, it just happens. But be aware of it when you place your hedge. Now, as an example, this hedge has had a big tree in front of it, an apple tree, which has had one of its branches actually coming into the hedge here, which has made one of the plants to die out completely. And now you have a big hole here. And this is what happens if you have a shady spot or a plant that starts to grow into your hedge. So if you do not want to have this in your garden, make sure that nothing comes too close to your hedge. Just keep it away from your hedge. Now, what you can do about this, if you have this in your garden, what you can do here is, one thing, you could actually try and remove this dead plant here. However, that is not an easy task, and you have intertwining roots down there, so you don't know which are the dead roots or which are the alive roots. What I recommend you to do instead is that you start to cut the edges of each branch here twice a year. You just cut a little bit off, What happens is it starts to bud and it starts to branch out. And when it branches out, you come in and you cut it again. And it branches out and you cut it again. And eventually this gap will be closed by these two plants instead. So you don't have to put a new plant here. You can actually make the older plants close together like this and create a new closed hedge. A very important thing to consider concerning your Thuja is that it reacts quite quickly and negative to salt. So if you're placing your hedge somewhere where you know that in wintertime you're using salt to get rid of the snow, then you need to stop doing that, because as soon as that salt reaches the roots of your Thuja, it will get damaged. So if you wanted to have it there, you need to stop using salt in wintertime. Otherwise you will get problems with your hedge. Moving on to the care of the plant. One of the most important things to remember as soon as you have gotten your newly planted hedge is that you need to give it water and even more water. It doesn't want to dry out in about 2 years. So our recommendation is usually that you try and put out some form of a watering system. It could be a micro drip system, or you can just place out some form of a sprinkler so that you make sure that it never dries out. And you need to water your plant, your newly planted hedge, as long as it's above about 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. So in wintertime, when it starts to get cold, then you stop watering. But as soon as spring arrives and it starts to get warmer again, start to water your hedge again. And you have to do this for about 2 years. After 2 years, you can consider your hedge to be mature. And usually all of the roots have matured enough so that you don't have to water it that much. But if you don't water your hedge enough, you will start to get a yellowing of the leaves. And you will also get burnt edges on the tips of the leaves. Now, a little of this is quite usual, because there is no placement that is completely perfect. But if you see that this is starting to happen, that is an indicator that you haven't given it enough water. And if you have dug out your trench in the right way, you don't have to worry about root rot, because that is the other end of that. If you give it too much water and it's standing in water, you will get root rot. And you will see that a large portion of the plant will start to get brown, just like that. And that usually means that the plant has problems with taking up water from the roots up to the plant. So it starts to get brown directly. Now, if that happens, then you know that you could have root rot and you need to cut back on the watering. Now, after a couple of years, what could happen is that some part of your hedge, a couple of the plants could die, and you get a hole, a black hole in your hedge. And it can look like this. What's happened here is that a couple of the plants have died, and they have planted new plants here. And the most important thing here is that you wait to cut off the tops until they reach the full length of the hedge. But you can start to prune the sides to get it to branch out even more, to become fuller. But eventually it will start to look like the original hedge. Now, as we said in the beginning, this is a cone-bearing seed plant, and the cones actually look like this. Now, depending on what type of weather you've had during the season, you will get a lot of cones or sometimes almost no cones. Now, if you have a very, very hot summer, you will get a lot of cones. And what happens with the old cones is that they look like this. So the plant is not feeling bad because you have a lot of brown here. This is just actually the old cones that has opened up and released the seeds, and then they are attached to the plant a little bit longer. So they will not fall off until 1 or 2 seasons later. A newly planted Thuja hedge needs a lot of nutrients. So we recommend you to, for the 2 first years, you need to be giving it fertilizer evenly throughout all of the active period. Now, that is during spring, summer and autumn. Now, the most important thing here is that you give nutrients. It doesn't really matter which type of nutrients you use. Just buy a full coverage garden fertilizer, and you can mix that up with the water when you water, or you can give it as a granulate or a pellets. When your plant gets to be older than 2 years, you don't have to give it that much of fertilizer because it is quite a tough plant. It doesn't need that much anymore. However, we recommend you to give at least 2 times a year when it gets older. The first time you give it is in early spring. Just when the plant is starting to grow, you add a fertilizer that is high on nitrogen. The nitrogen is helping with the chlorophyll in the leaves of the plant. It's actually helping the foliage to start to grow. So you add a fertilizer with high amounts of nitrogen. Then you give the second time in autumn. Now, in autumn you don't want the foliage to continue to grow. Now you want the plant to start and focus all of its energy on the root system and the vascular tissue inside of the plant. So you add a fertilizer that is low on nitrogen, but higher in all of the other types of nutrients. Usually it's called autumn fertilizer. What that means is that they have cut down on the nitrogen. You don't have to use a specific type of fertilizer, just use a complete coverage, but low on nitrogen in autumn. If you do that 2 times a year, that is enough to keep your hedge happy and continue to grow as much as you want. As we said in the beginning of this video, you can use a Thuja as a solitary plant. And usually that means that you just want it to grow and become big. But if you have a hedge, or if you want to keep it smaller, you need to start to prune your Thuja. Now by pruning it, it's quite easy. You can use a hedge trimmer, is the best way of pruning it, but you could also use a large scissor, but it just takes a longer time to prune your hedge. When it comes to pruning, there is a couple of things that you need to consider. First of all, you never ever cut off the tips of your hedge until it has reached the height that you want your hedge to be. So let it grow up to that point. If you want your hedge to be exactly 2 meters high, then you never prune the tops, the apex of your plant until it reaches just above 2 meters, and then you start pruning the tips of your plant. However, you can start to prune straight away, starting year 2. You can start to prune the sides of your hedge. Now the reason here is that the Thuja does not produce new buds on the interior of your plant. It doesn't produce new buds on the brown woody stems. It only produces new tips where you have the newer, greener foliage. So if you wait, if you start to prune the top of your Thuja, it will not continue to grow from that point. To be able to continue to grow upwards, it's actually some of the other branches that needs to take over and become the new apex. That is why you do not start to prune it until it reaches the height you want it to be. And also, if you don't start to prune the sides straight away, if they become too large and then you start to prune it back, you might be pruning it back all the way into that interior branching, and there it will not start to bud. So you need to start prune it a little bit every year. Now when it has reached the level you want it to, we recommend you to start pruning it once or twice a year. And this is all depending on how dense and nice you want your hedge to be. If you prune it once a year, I would recommend you to prune it in autumn. Here in Sweden we call it JAS, July, August, September. The end of summer, the beginning of autumn, that is usually the best time of year to prune your hedge. However, I always prune mine twice a year. I prune it in autumn, but I also prune it just before it starts to grow in springtime. So in late winter, early spring, you can also prune it. And that time of year, you don't prune it a lot, you just prune it a little bit. Because what happens then, if you prune it often, you will get it to branch out even more and it will become denser. So you get that really, really dense hedge. If that's what you're looking for, you need to prune it twice a year. But you don't have to, you can prune it just once a year. The Thuja doesn't have many problems other than when it gets too dry. So pests is usually not something you need to worry about concerning the Thuja. However, it is a local problem. So I would recommend you to start searching in your countries which type of pests that can attack your Thujas, because it's quite different in different parts of the world. Here in Sweden we have two main problems with our Thujas. Now the first one we call kvistdöd, or twig death in English. And that is caused by a fungus called Cabatina thuja or Cabatina juniperus. Now what happens with that fungus is that your leaf starts to turn yellow. All of the plant starts to turn light yellow, and then quickly it switches from yellow to brown, completely brown. And this happens quite fast. So usually there is not much you can do about that. But this is something we have to struggle with here in Sweden, called kvistdöd. And that usually comes from when the temperatures are low but the humidity is high. So when in spring or in autumn, if you have low temperatures and a lot of moisture in the air, that fungus can actually, what happens when it rains is that it hits the ground and moves up on the twigs of the plant, and then it starts to spread on the Thuja. Now the other problem we get here is often root rot. Now that happens also when it rains a lot, when you have a lot of moisture in the air and it has been raining and raining and raining. Now if you haven't dug out that trench enough, so your roots are actually starting to stand in water, you will get root rot. And one of the ways you can see this is that your hedge could even start to move a little bit, because a lot of the roots have started to die and they are not attaching your plant to the soil anymore. So it starts to become a little bit wobbly. And when that happens, there's often not much you can do. It will probably start to die off, sadly. Now the Thuja is often used in medicinal purposes, and it's used for things like bronchitis or bacterial infections. However, I would not recommend you to try and do that yourself. Please consider that this plant is a little bit poisonous, so if you try and eat it, you could react to it, you could get sick from it, and then please go to the hospital and tell them what has happened. Now the last thing I want to go through with you is that if you do not want to put your Thuja in the ground, you can actually put it in a pot instead. It works perfectly. Now what you need to consider when putting it in a pot is a couple of things. First of all, you need a big pot. It's the same thing when you put it in a pot as when you dig the trench in the ground. You need to have a pot that is quite larger than the root ball that your original plant has. And the reason for this is that when you have it in a pot, it's easier for that to start to dry out. So you want a lot of soil around the roots that are moist, and they are moist a long time. So the soil you should be using is a soil that has a lot of compost material or humus in it. So use a soil that has a lot of compost and has good drainage as well. Now a self-watering system works perfectly for a Thuja, because what happens in a self-watering system is that when you water, and you need to water a lot in the beginning, all of that excess water is going to start to fall down into your water container underneath the inner pot. And then you have something that will start to suck up that water again to keep that moisture inside of that inner pot. That is a perfect way, because if you plant it in a big pot that doesn't have drainage holes and you start to water your plant, it's fairly easy that it will stand in water inside of that pot. And if it does that, it will get root rot, you will get problems, and it will probably die quite quickly. So make sure that it has good drainage, either with holes in the bottom of the pot or if you put it in a self-watering system. Now another thing to consider is the placement. If you place your plant in a very sunny spot, you need to make sure that it never dries out. You need to keep it adding that water to keep that moisture around the roots. Because if it starts to dry out when the sun is out, you will straight away start to get a yellowing of the leaves, and you will also get burnt edges on the needles or on the leaves. So make sure that it's always a little bit damp. You can also put it in a darker spot, but if you do that, it's the same way as when you put your hedge out. If you put it in a darker spot, the plant itself will become a little bit thinner. There will be a little bit more space in between the different branches. So a lot of sun will make it more compact, a lot of dark will make it a little bit thinner. And that's of course a very personal reference of what you want your Thuja to look like. Now the Thuja is quite frost hardy, so you don't have to put away your pot in the winter time. Now At least not if you know that you don't have extreme freezing temperatures. You can have it outside, it's usually not a problem. What you need to consider though is that when springtime starts to arrive and the sun is coming out and the temperatures is starting to arise, you could still have a root ball that is frozen. And if that sun hits that plant, what happens is that all of the moisture in the foliage is starting to evaporate, which means that the plant wants to start to drink that water, but it can't because it's frozen. That will kill your plant. So what you need to watch out for in the beginning of spring is that the root ball is not frozen. If it's still frozen when springtime arrives, then move your plant somewhere where it's a little bit darker, a little bit shadier. Even better if you can move it inside a greenhouse or somewhere where it gets a little bit warmer so that that ball can start to thaw. And when you see that root ball is completely thawed and it can start to drink water again, then you can move it out to the spot you want it again. Just be aware of that and keep a lookout for that early spring sun so that it doesn't harm or kill your plants. Now that is all you need to know about the Thuja occidentalis. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that bell as well so you get a notification every time we put up something new. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, that helps us a lot. And also please share with your friends. Now until next time, hej då!